Hello, class. This is Mr. Raman here, and in today's lesson, we're going to focus on text structure. Specifically, we're going to look at two different text types. The first we're going to look at are poems. Okay, so a poem is something that looks like this image you see here. The second text we're going to look at today is a narrative, which looks like this image here. Take a moment to look at the differences and how these two texts look. So, yesterday in class, we focused on different sound devices for poetry. And in today's lesson, we're just going to focus on what makes a poem in terms of structure, meaning how does a poem look different from that of a narrative? Throughout English class and all our other classes, we encounter various types of texts. For example, in our tone lesson, we analyzed an image, we analyzed a video, we've analyzed songs. All these are considered different types of texts. So today we're going to focus on two specifically. First is poems. So in poems, the first major rule is that we learned yesterday it can contain repetition. Okay, that is where words are repeated to create some sort of effect. If you look at the poem to the right here, you'll notice at the very end that the word chance is repeated twice. That is an example of repetition. The second element of poetry we want you to focus on is that it contains different sound devices. The sound devices were taught to you yesterday, which were alliteration, repetition, as well as onomatopoeias. And the third important element we want you to consider is that in poetry, grammar rules are not important. You don't necessarily have to follow them like you would when you're writing other types of written responses. So just remember that grammar is not always that important. For example, in this poem, in the third line, it says, a life lived in parts. This is not grammatically correct as it is missing a subject, as well as there is a verb disagreement here. But as a poem, it works, and we wouldn't mark it incorrect because that is how the poet feels. So, when thinking of poetry, we want you to think of these three key components to their structure when analyzing. That a poem can have structure, it can have different sound devices, and that grammar rules are not important. Okay, moving on. Then we've got narratives, right? We are going to be writing a narrative for our final product for this project where you describe your own conflict and how you resolved it. And so, what are certain elements that you need to include in your narrative, and what are elements that all narratives should have in their structure? Well, first, all narratives should contain characters. Without characters, you don't have any stories that are moving the action forward. However, once you have characters, you definitely need a conflict. Without conflict, there is no action to take, there is no growth for the characters. In addition, narratives should contain dialogue. Dialogue is when your characters express their thoughts and feelings through words and using quotation marks. Dialogue is another way to build your characters and conflict. Furthermore, narratives should definitely follow grammar rules. If they don't, it becomes hard to understand the text, and the author's meaning can get confusing. So that's why it's important to follow grammar rules. And finally, narratives can contain literal language. All right, literal language is when you mean exactly what you say. So if I say I'm literally going to throw this pencil at you, I would then pick up a pencil and throw it at you. So, once again, when thinking about narratives for this project, I want you to focus on these five elements for today. They are characters, conflict, dialogue, grammar rules, and literal language. Now, There are certain things that both texts have in common, and these are things that we need to be mindful of when we're analyzing different texts. So, both poems and narratives can talk about feelings, sentimientos, and so it depends on how they talk about their feelings, right? In a narrative, they would write it in a paragraph form. In poetry, they would have more freedom on how they would want to express it. Both texts can use figurative language. Figurative language can include similes, metaphors, hyperboles, personification, onomatopoeias. Next week, you will learn more types of figurative language that you can include in your writing. And finally, both texts can contain different sentence types. This is based on a lesson from a few days ago where we learned the declarative, interrogative, imperative, and exclamatory. All these four sentence types can be used for both poems and narratives. If you notice on the poem, the third to last line contains a question. Is reality a prison or is it a change? Whereas on the right, I know it's a little difficult to see, but the first line says, learning something new can be a scary experience. This is a declarative sentence as the author is declaring something, an idea. And so there you have it. Now, this does not cover all the elements of poetry and narratives. And in fact, as we get further into the projects, you will learn more about narratives and you will learn more about poetry. However, this is our focus for our lesson today. Thank you, and make sure you have all your notes completed correctly.